Welcome to another wonderful Susannah Calloway audiobook. We are excited to have you with us. Before we begin the story, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. This allows us to continue adding free clean Western romance audiobooks for you to enjoy. The following title is copyrighted by Susannah Calloway, Western romance author. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and enjoy the story. Trusting Alan. Chapter 1. Jess, I know you don't want me dragging you by the ears to get your meal. Margaret's brother gave her a tanned, dirt-smeared smile. His charm was not lost on her as he moved through the lush fields of green and gold. She couldn't help but gawk at him as he strutted toward her in his filthy boots. He wouldn't make it through the door with that dirt-encrusted leather on his feet, and he knew it. Take off those filthy boots. I just swept the floor, she ordered, making a shadow of a gesture as if to smack him on the shoulder. Jess didn't bother moving away. Instead, he ignored her mock jab and walked right past her with a huge grin. You sure you're not our mother? 'Cause you're starting to sound just like her, he teased, taking off the boots with very little resistance. Despite herself, Margaret grinned and patted down the smock that covered her cream-colored dress. Even with his childlike attitude at times, Jess was a pleasure to live with, and Margaret loved her brother dearly. They were all the other had, as both their parents had ended up dying nearly a decade earlier due to the sudden snap of influenza that had raged through the town within a matter of months. It had been difficult as neither of them were notably skilled with taking care of the farm and were forced to rely on the kindness of their hires to teach them the ropes of the business. I can be like her if you want. But I'm afraid I don't got a switch on me, though. Margaret did, in fact, take after their mother heavily in looks. Her hair was a thick, sun-kissed brunette that went down her back, unbraided. Her eyes were dark enough that they seemed to swallow the light in dim moonlight, but tan enough that anyone with half a brain could tell that they were honeysuckle brown. Her complexion was fairly pale with only a dusting of freckles, despite how often she was out in the sunlight. She supposed that her hats were good for something. Margaret took her time putting the food on the table, though it was set up prior to calling Jess in for the meal. She was always wise enough to wait for the pot to cool, as she knew that Jess wouldn't hesitate to jab the spoon into his mouth and burn himself. She didn't feel like hearing him complain for the next few days about a rough tongue. Did Jeffrey get back to you about the grain shipment? She questioned, only to receive a twitchy look from her brother. Nah. He's still waiting to hear from someone in New York about transportation fees. Something about haggling down the cut in pay. Margaret let out a deep breath, silently disappointed but unwilling to admit it. It had been more than a month, and it was the same story. If they hadn't been doing business with the man for as many years as they had, she would have thought he was hustling them. Now, don't make that face, sis. The deal'll come through. It always has. With both of them managing the farm, they had been able to live relatively comfortably. After the first few years, they had hired a few more men to tend the fields, and they had gained a larger clientele outside the nearby towns. Their success had given them some welcome breathing room. I know. Doesn't mean I don't have the right to worry, Margaret responded, smiling as she reached over to grab her bonnet from where she had left it near the door. Jess looked up from his mouthful. Where you going? Their farm was planted firmly on the outskirts of town, but it was still somewhat unsafe for her to be walking anywhere alone nearing the end of the day. Just to visit Eliza and her babe. The poor thing's kicking up a bit of a fuss, and Eliza's worried. Margaret smiled reassuringly to her brother as she wrapped a thick layer of cloth around her shoulders. Is Doc Murray not here? Being the only doctor living in the area wasn't all that it was cracked up to be. Doc spent much of his time with their town, yet he was often called on a serious case or two in a town roughly a week's ride there and back. It was heavily inconvenient and part of the reason Margaret had taken up the study of healing herself. He's out of town until sometime tomorrow or the next day, and we've known Eliza since we were young'uns. What kind of friend would I be not to help her when I can? Jess looked at her for a long minute, weighing his options before getting up from his seat. She called out his name, exasperated as he disappeared into another part of their little house. Before Margaret could kick up a fuss, he was back with what seemed to be a Jess. She backed away from the pistol in her brother's hand, her eyes wide as she alternated her gaze from the gun to her brother's frustrated expression. He rolled his eyes before holding the weapon out, handle jutting toward her almost menacingly. "You know it's illegal to carry a gun into town, concealed or otherwise." "Sheriff's orders," she protested, not daring to raise her voice, illogically fearing that if she spoke any louder, trouble would find her one way or another. "I don't care. No one's going to know if you just go in and out. Please, take it for my own peace of mind." Margaret fidgeted in place, feeling clear discomfort at the idea. She knew how to wield a gun if she had to. Her pa had made sure of that. The road going deeper into town was rather dangerous, and reasonably, a gun would be helpful if an outlaw should try to sneak up on her. "Fine," she snapped, looking down at the gun with dismay as she wrapped her dainty fingers around the handle. "There should be 4 bullets left in there. Don't waste 'em." She prayed silently that she wouldn't have to pull it out at all. Chapter 2. Thankfully, the path to Eliza's was clear and lit up as the sky had only just begun turning shades of vivid yellow and purple. Margaret kept her hand to her bag at all times, mentally going over what she would say to her friend to get home as quickly as possible, perhaps even before the night fully fell. She rushed forward as she approached Eliza's part of town, smiling and greeting the few who were still out and about before the night brought out those components who preferred night to day. While Maysville, Kentucky, was nothing to write home about, Eliza lived in the more well-kept area of the town. The buildings were built well, and the people dressed in somewhat fashionable garments compared to the plain fabric she found comfortable. In truth, Margaret was aware that she was plain in most regards, but her surroundings made her feel even more so. "Margaret? You're here." She gazed in the direction of the voice to see a blonde with her hair put up in a tight bun and stress lines crinkling under her eyes from the clear lack of sleep. "Land's sakes, you look horrible," Margaret couldn't help but exclaim at Eliza. She had no time to take back her words as she was quickly pulled into Eliza's home. "He won't stop crying, and he's been running a fever for hours. I thought it was just a cold like my eldest got when he was little, but I'm worried it may be something else." Eliza's face was twisted in a mix of worry and exhaustion. From the lack of noise, other than the baby, it was clear that Eliza's husband had probably gone out to drink to get away from the crying, as he often did, Margaret knew. Good, Margaret thought. One less boy crying. The sobbing became more pronounced as she looked around, and she couldn't help but feel her heart wrench at the painful noise. She couldn't stand the thought of a child in such pain. It took very little time to notice another blonde woman with strands of gray lining her hairline cradling the child in her arms. It was clear that the older woman was trying to soothe the boy but was failing miserably. From the sharp blue eyes and the gaze refined with age, Margaret could make a sure guess that the woman was Eliza's mother. "I think his fever has gone down in the last hour or so, but I don't know," Eliza said. "Why in the world did you call another woman to fuss over the boy?" "Not like she could help," the woman stated, clearly miffed at Margaret's presence. "She's trained in medicine, mother," Eliza snapped, looking very done with politeness. Margaret was unofficially trained, yes, but she had never gone to any schooling for it. Most of her knowledge came from the sparse books she could get her hands on and a kind medicine man who lived on the Indian reservation not too far away. She had managed to befriend the man as a child, and he continued to be a wealth of knowledge for her to the present day. Margaret couldn't allow herself to be as unprepared for disastrous events as she had been in those final weeks when she'd watched her parents wither away in their beds. "Let me see the child, if you will," she requested as politely as she could manage, recognizing that Eliza's mother was not one to be trifled with. After a moment of indecision, the woman reluctantly came closer to allow Margaret to see the child as he whimpered and let out a powerful cry or two when he found the wind. Taking a closer look, it was clear the boy was highly uncomfortable, but all symptoms pointed toward a common cold. "I can give you a tonic that he'll have to take twice a day for an entire week. And when I say the entire week, I mean the entire week and not any less," Margaret stressed, digging into her bag to pull out the glass bottle of tonic she kept among other pain reducers and treatments she had on hand all the time. "You won't need much, just a teaspoon. It'll even make him sleepy so he won't be crying his lungs out and keeping the both of you up." Eliza took the remedy in both hands as if she were holding the essence of life in her palms. To a mother who had been dealing with a crying child non-stop, it probably was a fairly accurate likeness. Margaret was in a bit of a hurry to leave, but she somehow found herself being pulled into a discussion about the latest gossip. No matter how many times she opened her mouth, the two women seemed to have a sixth sense when it came to disrupting her plans to leave. Funny how the boy's grandmother now seemed eager for her to stay. It was after much patience and forced politeness that Margaret was finally walking out of the door and back onto the dirt path leading to her home. She silently chastised herself as she saw the darkness of the night sky and felt the chill in the air. She had spent far too long talking with Eliza and her mother, despite her efforts to get in and out as fast as she possibly could. Her anxiety grew as she walked toward the outskirts of town, avoiding, as much as she could, the noises of drunken men and laughing women in and near the saloons. One of her hands was inside of her bag, holding on to the handle of the pistol as she carefully crept through the mostly sleepy town. It took a moment longer than she would have liked to get to the tree line, but all she could think of was that she was nearly home. Margaret couldn't figure out what spooked her, she only knew that she was troubled in spirit. Something was urging her forward, driving her to get home as soon as possible. She was ready to cry in relief once she caught sight of the farm and, specifically, the house. Despite the feeling of relief at seeing the familiar sight, she was taken aback by a dread that was building in her stomach. It took her a moment to realize why she felt as if someone had snatched away her last breath and left her gasping for air. The door to her home was wide open. Chapter 3. It was only her momentary grasp of logic that kept her from breaking into a sprint. Instead, Margaret carefully made her way closer to the no longer calming sight of her home. The open door mocked her, calling to her with horrible foreboding. She cringed when she stepped on a branch not far from their porch and the wood creaked beneath her foot. She hesitated, listening intently. After a moment of nothing but the crickets chirping, she moved once again. She made it to the open door and carefully opened it wider in order to see what was inside. Margaret let out a shocked cry when she saw dear Jess, her baby brother, sprawled face down across the floor. Forgetting caution, she burst into the house, crying his name. She nearly tripped over shattered porcelain, as she made her way to his side. The first thing she did was turn him over to face the ceiling, only to be shocked with the sight in the dim lantern light. His face was white, and blood soaked his shirt. Margaret let out a sob as his foggy eyes stared up at her, clearly disoriented. Whatever had happened, it must have been shortly after she'd left, for Jess's blood had crusted over the fabric in a manner that made it difficult to identify where he had been wounded. Hurry, she thought. She had to fix this and quick. He had to have been shot. She raced for the small box of supplies under the bed in her room. It included different tools among multiple bottles with a variety of herbs and liquids that suddenly seemed far too sparse for the situation. After a second, she ran over to grab the whiskey they had hidden away after their parents died. Her hands shook as she took out the knife stashed in the makeshift medical box. Despite her trembling hands, she made quick work of cutting the white fabric so that it no longer hindered her view of a sluggishly bleeding wound. "I'm sorry, you." Margaret, Jess's weak voice was barely audible. "Don't speak," Margaret told him as she took a look at the entry wound. Maybe it wasn't as bad as she feared. But she would have to dig inside if she were to remove the bullet. And she must remove it, mustn't she? Doc always did. The thought made her skin crawl and her stomach clench with fear. Despite this, she reached into the box to pull out a relatively small pair of tongs. After a moment of hesitation, she reached for the flask of whiskey. "This is going to hurt, Jess," she told him. His only response was to roll his eyes and try valiantly to smile. Despite his bravado, he eagerly swallowed down a good mouthful of the whiskey when she held it to his lips. They both winced when Margaret gently pressed a hand right under the right side of his ribs. His bloodied hands twitched at his sides as he groaned. "Dear God," he whispered, shaking his head slightly as his sister worked to find the bullet. He shook his head again when she offered him a towel to bite down on. "Hush," she stated, tight-lipped as she worked to control her panic. Jess spit out the towel. They was wanting to rob," he hollered out in pain, and she stuffed the towel back in his mouth. She gulped and tried with all her might to keep her hands from shaking any worse as she rummaged around looking for the tiny piece of metal that may or may not have hit something important. "Maggie, don't cry." Jess had managed to free his mouth again. One bloodied hand lifted, as if to comfort her, only to come back down heavily with a barely bit down groan of pain. She swiped at her tears before trying again to find the bullet. It took a moment of feeling around with the tongs before she finally found it. It had taken too long for her liking to find the piece of metal. Jess squirmed despite his best efforts to remain still and allow her to work. Her arms strained and cramped with exertion as she worked with one hand holding down her brother's body and the other clutching tightly to the tongs. When she was finally able to pull the bullet out, she couldn't help but stare at the shining metal for a second, the light of the lantern displaying the shine in a display that would have been fascinating if it hadn't just come from her brother's chest. She was quick to drop the bullet before reaching over for the whiskey. "I'm sorry," she whispered, as she dampened a towel with a decent amount of the alcohol. Margaret took a deep breath before finally placing the cloth onto the freshly bleeding wound. She was barely able to hold Jess down as he bucked underneath her, letting out a choked scream. Despite his shouts of pain, she pressed on, holding the cloth to his wound, dabbing occasionally and cleaning the surrounding skin. Reaching back into the box, she pulled out rolls of thin cloth. "You'll be fine," she said, though at that point, she was saying it more to herself than to Jess. Horror scenarios were going through her head as she tried to figure out what to do next. Chapter 4. It should have worried her that Jess barely made a sound when she tied the knot tightly around his torso, but she was just relieved that she had managed to bandage him successfully. Letting out a shaky sigh, she rocked back onto her heels, finally allowing herself to take in her surroundings now that she deemed the greatest danger to have passed. The house was in ruins. The table was turned over and all their belongings were strewn across the floor, broken or crumpled. Anything of value was probably gone, which likely included her mother's pearls and her father's old set of pocket watches. "Maggie, get me to bed." She looked down, crying as she considered the request. She didn't want to move him. It would be too dangerous. What if the bleeding increased? "Maggie." "No. I'll keep you here." He groaned and shifted on the floor, seeming strangely obsessed with getting to his bed. "Stop moving," she ordered him. "I mean it." But he wouldn't listen. Finally, not wanting him to move on his own, she squatted down and hefted him up. She carefully reached one arm under his shoulders and threw his arm around her own. She stumbled multiple times as she attempted to get him up, his weight throwing her off. It took longer and much more exertion than she had anticipated to get him to the other room. She nearly collapsed on the spot, only barely grabbing a chair to halt her path downward. "I'll call for the doc tomorrow when he gets back in town." Jess smiled weakly up at her and then promptly passed out. She gave a cry of alarm and leaned close, nearly sobbing in relief as she felt his breath on her skin. He was alive. He was still alive. She closed her eyes and sent up a desperate prayer. "Let him be all right," she pleaded silently. "Please, please God, let him be all right." Margaret couldn't bring herself to leave Jess's side, remaining awake and wide-eyed for most of the night. Finally, no matter how much she hovered and worried, she couldn't fight her exhaustion any longer. She didn't know how long she'd been asleep when she was bolted awake by a watery cough. Margaret froze at the unnatural sound, looking up wildly. How long had she been asleep? The lantern light flickered in the room. Jess was red-faced and sweating, panting heavily as if he were having a difficult time breathing. Pulling back the blankets, Margaret blanched at the sight of the red-stained bandage. He had bled right through the fabric. "Jess," she whispered, putting as much pressure on the wound as she felt he could bear. When he barely responded, her panic grew. Maybe she had caused further harm by removing the bullet. Maybe there were 2 bullets, and she'd missed one. She shouldn't have moved him. She touched his forehead and cried out at the heat radiating from his skin. She glanced out the window and noted it was still nighttime. Where could she go for help? The reservation and the medicine man were too far away. She didn't dare leave Jess for that long. And Doc wouldn't be back yet. She was alone, truly alone, and she was terrified. Numb, she went back to the front room to grab her supplies. She was quick to come back, but she found no pleasure in the act of peeling off Jess's bandage, cleaning the wound again, and rewrapping it. She made sure to tighten the gauze tightly around his middle, trying to slow down the blood. She just had to keep him alive until the doctor was back in town. Doc would have to pass the road near the farm as he returned, so Margaret could stop him when he came through. So, she waited. And waited, bathing Jess's forehead with cool wet cloths. She shed a few tears and treated him the best she could, wondering multiple times if she should just get up and go to town herself to see if anyone could help her. But all that came to her mind was coming back and finding that her brother had died alone because she had been gone too long. The bleeding had stopped, but it was clear that Jess had lost far too much blood, and that his fever was only making his condition worse. He was only sometimes conscious, and even then, he was delirious and spouted nonsense. In his short periods of awareness, he would look up at her with sad eyes that seemed to understand something that she had yet to accept. The first time he told her that she didn't need to keep fighting a lost cause, she angrily retorted that he needed to stay quiet and concentrate on healing. The second and third times were met with much less fanfare and fight. She was tired and soaked in fear, and despite how much she wanted to believe in her own abilities, she knew that Jess was beyond her. All she could do was watch his shallow breathing grow slower and slower, and his small smile grow weaker and weaker as he attempted to comfort her. Her heart was heavy with grief and sorrow, and she was unable to suppress her small sobs every time he attempted to speak. Her tears refused to dry, blurring her vision and keeping her from seeing clearly. Perhaps it was a blessing, for her tears prevented her from seeing the very life drain from his eyes. Chapter 5. The farmhouse felt less like a home and more like a graveyard. The walls held echoes of good times, but it was as if the dead had taken over the residence. Margaret's entire immediate family had died within those suffocating walls, every one of them choking on their breath and delirious with fever. And now, here she was. The unwitting survivor of multiple tragedies. If only she had been there when the outlaws had come, she sobbed. Jess would have had his gun. The condolences she received were empty and pallid. They were the same words over and over again. He will be missed. I'm so sorry for your loss. He's in a better place now. What was worse was when the town began to speak about the farm. They asked questions for which she didn't have answers. They asked her what she planned to do, and all she could say was that she hadn't made any decisions yet. Decisions? Margaret had no idea what she was doing. She walked through her days like someone walking through thick fog. Yet she knew that there was no way she could run the farm alone. Nor did she have the wherewithal to hire out everything that needed doing. Eliza's friendship was both a gift and a curse. Eliza had once been highly idealistic, she told Margaret. She had been a woman who dreamt of the perfect husband, but instead, she had been given one who didn't care a whit about her. However, even with her sham of a marriage, Eliza was aware of the importance of her standing as a married woman. She suggested that perhaps now was the time for Margaret to consider marriage. It will give you something to live for, Eliza kindly said, looking down at her own child who slept like an angel now. That very same child whose illness had caused Margaret's absence when Jess was attacked. Looking at the sweetness in Eliza's gaze to her son, something in Margaret cried out, desperate to end her suffocating loneliness. It was why, clad in a black gown and an equally dark bonnet, Margaret had even given a second glance to the flyer stuck to the notice board near the saloon. The whispers around her and the pitying glances that stared at her black dress made her rip the notice down from where it was nailed. It was a bad idea. It was a desperate idea, however, it was an idea and an option, nonetheless. Clenched in her fist, the thick piece of parchment paper creased. Margaret thought of getting away from the pitying glances, from the people who questioned her future, and from those who stared at her. She thought of running far away, just as she had when her parents had died. This time, there was no Jess to keep her from throwing herself into the raging tides and letting them take her where they would. There was no one and nothing keeping her tied to the land that she had been raised on, except for memories that edged on painful more days than not. She was free of her obligations to this godforsaken place that had left her alone and desolate. Despite Margaret's desperation to get out, her cheeks burned in embarrassment as she held the paper close to her and out of view from anyone around her. Quickly, she scurried back to her empty home. She couldn't believe that she had sunk to such levels as to even consider looking for a new path in this manner. She had gone into town to talk with some of Jess's business partners. They had looked at her with a mixture of pity and disbelief, as if they couldn't understand how this little woman could ever hope to take her brother's place at the round table. Frequently, they spoke over her and ignored what few points she attempted to share. By midday, she knew it wasn't going to work. So, she picked herself up, and without a word, excused herself from their company. She tried to pretend that she hadn't run, though that probably would have been more believable if she hadn't tripped on her skirts on the way out. The flyer now in her possession had been innocently placed among others of its kind. It had been partially buried by another advertisement from the same agency, and it took her very little time to realize that the flyer must have been up for a great deal of time. It had minimal print, though enough to assure the potential client that they were a legitimate business and to give the necessary information. Mail order bride. Even now, as she stared at the printed words, her stomach twisted inside her. But even so, that night she sat down with only the light of a single candle to keep her company. She wrote and rewrote her letter, throwing away draft after draft. It was a fine balance, attempting to write her best qualities while downplaying them so as to not seem vain or too good to be true. She wanted to get matched, and she wanted it to happen as quickly as it could be arranged by the mail order bride agency. She whispered a small prayer as she sent off her letter. When she thought of what Jess's reaction would have been to her course of action, that was, perhaps, the first time she wondered if she was making a mistake. What if she ended up with someone who went out more nights than not? What if he was a horrible man who simply wanted to use her for his own purposes? It was a good thing that she didn't sleep too deeply most nights. Margaret really didn't need to see the added imagery of multiple bottles of alcohol her possible husband imbibed added to the bloodied bandages that haunted her whenever she closed her eyes. Despite her doubts, Margaret carried on. She managed the farm to the best of her ability and watched as her hands bled and toughened with calluses. Every night, she would drag her feet into the place she had once called home, and collapse. If this kept up, there was no doubt that she would look like a worn-down old maid long before she was out of her prime. Finally, and with great relief, she received a letter notifying her that not only had she been accepted, but that the agency had also found her a match. Alan Jameson wasn't a name that popped out to her as anything other than ordinary, yet she couldn't help but repeat it over and over. Her future husband was her chance to get out of the ghost house and attempt to heal her tired and broken soul. Perhaps, he would try to break her down as well. She shook her head at the thought. She had made her decision. It was far too late to turn back, and it would have been unfair to her brand new fiancé. Surprisingly, it took very little time to be ready for her departure. During the month prior to receiving her response, she had been preparing for the moment when she would finally be able to leave. It hadn't taken much effort to sell the farm for a decent price, leaving her in a good place should the marriage end up not working out. She felt better having a second plan, considering how impulsive her first was. Putting her clothes and personal matter into 2 small trunks, it was the first time she realized exactly how little she had to call her own. Almost everything with value had been stolen that horrible night, leaving her with bare essentials, and it wasn't as if she could take the furniture or the glassware with her, as impossible and impractical as that would be. Grabbing a sewing needle and thread, she lined the inner layer of fabric on her skirt with multiple pockets that were evenly distributed. She had sewn for most of her life as it was a necessity for most women in her day and age, yet she found her hands shaking as she stitched in the hidden layers. She pricked her fingers more than once, almost bleeding onto the thick cloth. And then she carefully filled the pockets with as much cash as she could without making it obvious that there was something seriously off with the dress. She then stitched the pockets closed. She was going into unfamiliar territory with money that her new husband could take away from her if he knew about it. Times had changed since her mother was alive, but it didn't mean that she would be able to defend her right to have money stashed away. She wasn't sure about the actual laws, but public opinion still had a long way to go. Besides, she didn't know this man who would be her husband, nor had she received much information about him. She needed to be careful. The money was, of course, all that she had gotten from selling the farm. Thankfully, she had been able to receive the funds in full before she had to depart. Eliza hugged the living daylights out of her when Margaret shared her plans, but it was telling that Eliza didn't attempt to change her mind. A knowing look in her eyes told Margaret all she needed to know. And then Eliza had gone back into her own house again, tending to her husband who went out more nights than not and a baby who wailed and wailed. Margaret didn't understand how a woman could willingly continue to walk back into a relationship where she knew she would be unhappy. But then, what options did women really have? It was humbling to realize that she might be walking into the exact situation by her own decision, so desperate to get away that she was prepared to hand herself over to a man she didn't know. Yet, she continued to sew, she continued to pack, she continued to shed tears. She felt no less empty as days turned to weeks and she was finally given more information about her betrothed. Chapter 6. Margaret did find out that Alan was a tall man, much taller than average, and that he had dark hair and blue eyes. Walking to the train station, she read of the small ranch he ran. There was no real information about his character. Nothing that gave her a clue as to what she would really face. Once aboard the train and on her way to the nearest stop in the state of Colorado, Margaret started to doubt. Her doubt grew rapidly now that she wasn't so busy and able to suppress it. As the miles churned by, she wondered constantly if she was doing the right thing. She had the horrifying image that she was actually shipping herself off like the cattle her husband-to-be no doubt traded and sold in equal measure. She felt the pit in her stomach grow as her reasoning started to scream at her. It vaguely sounded like her brother, and that made it all the worse. She had to duck her head more than once to hide the tears that had begun to flow down her cheeks at the oddest times during the day. Never had she felt more like a child begging for her mother's skirts to hide behind. As she heard the conductor announce another stop, so close to the last stop after so many days of travel, she stiffened and shook. What a fool she was, she thought. What a pretty little idiot, believing that she could run from one shadow to another. She could practically feel the awkward hovering of someone nearby, probably debating whether they should approach. Margaret raised her eyes to meet, unexpectedly, a young boy. The child immediately took off, probably to hide behind his mother as most children his age were prone to do when faced with the unknown. Somehow, that was enough to take her head out of her hands. There was no use crying about what she had willingly gotten herself into. This had been her own choice, not something she'd been forced into by some heartless soul. Sniffing a bit, she discreetly dabbed at her eyes, hoping to save some face. Crying in public wouldn't help her, and it made Margaret feel depressed in a way that she had been pushing against since Jess had succumbed to his injury. She squared her shoulders. She would take whatever the world had left to throw at her, she thought, her eyes darting around the other passengers nervously. It wasn't as if she had much left. The small trunks carrying her only living possessions were carefully placed under her. She had refused to have them placed in the storage compartment, and they were small enough to be placed beneath her seat. She had started to regret the decision when she realized that anyone would be able to open them up when she fell asleep. It was safe to say that any sleep she got was uncomfortable and brief. Chapter 7. Margaret's arrival to her destination was the strangest thing she had ever experienced. The morning air had her breathing mist and shivering in her ill-suited clothing. She chastised herself for not thinking about the seasonal differences. Hopefully, her new husband would allow her to purchase new clothing for herself or provide her the material to make her own. Surely, he wouldn't want his new wife shivering in her boots. Of course, she did have her own money, but she wasn't inclined to divulge that information too quickly. On top of the cold, Margaret noticed the bustle of the town with its numerous people and many establishments. It was easily larger than her small town in Kentucky. It made her feel small, but it also comforted her somehow. Perhaps she would stand out less here, not be a curiosity to others. She rather liked that idea, relishing the thought of blending in. Shivering, she made her way to the church as she was instructed to do by the letter that the agency had sent her alongside the written description of her betrothed. She politely turned down anyone who attempted to help her with her bags, not knowing whom to trust. But in the end, she had to ask for help from a sturdy-looking lad, for she couldn't carry the trunks alone. On her way to the church, she looked askance at the women with painted lips on the street corners who leered at her and at anyone who looked like they had medium-sized pockets. The bustle of Clay's Pike was wearing on her by the time she reached the church. Her confused gaze must have been an invitation for someone to appear from quite literally nowhere and start a conversation. "Hello, miss, is there anything I can do for you?" Margaret blinked up at the man dumbly for a moment. He was clean-cut in a tailored dark gray suit and a trimmed beard. She suspected he was much younger than the beard made him out to be. Yes, I'm looking for an Alan Jameson." His eyes seemed to brighten in recognition, and he smiled in a way that made her vaguely uncomfortable. "We've been expecting you, Miss Wayland. My name is Ralph Fuller, and I will be representing both you and Mr. Jameson during this joyous occasion. Please, come with me." He offered his arm and gestured with his free hand toward the door of the church. Margaret was too aware of the smooth fabric against her skin, and she found herself wondering if her husband was as well kept as this man seemed to be. She was so nervous, she barely kept from strangling the man's arm as he led her into the church. She felt slightly guilty when she felt him wince beneath her grip. "Normally, we would have had arranged the wedding to take place the minute you stepped off the train. But as both of you requested an immediate match and haven't even corresponded, we thought that, perhaps, you might like to meet each other first. You know, spend an hour or two together before the ceremony." It was reasonable and even welcome news, even though it was not helping Margaret with all the horrible thoughts of what could go wrong. What if she wasn't to her future husband's liking? What if he wasn't to her liking? What if they despised each other at first sight? In reality, what she was finally confronted with wasn't what she expected, not in the least. Alan had described himself as plain, but he was clearly anything but. Dressed in a black suit, though it wasn't tailored well, he was absolutely stunning. He hadn't noticed her entrance at first, for he was talking to an older gentleman holding a small book close to his chest. Was that the preacher? It was the clacking of her heels against the wood flooring or maybe the sound of the door closing that drew his attention to her for the first time. He had described his eyes as a pale blue, but he had underestimated their appeal. Indeed, they were nearly glacial, almost exotic on his tanned face. They certainly stood out as an admired feature. His hair was slicked back against his scalp, revealing a widow's peak. His facial bones were sharp and distinct, giving him a look of authority. Despite her assumptions, she was actually quite surprised at how young he was. She had always thought that the service was used by men and women alike who were getting older, but the man who stood in front of her was perhaps only a few years older than she, and she was young, barely 19. She had known his age prior to boarding the train, of course, but she had somehow expected that to be a falsehood. It took her a few seconds to realize that he was studying her, weighing her appearance as she was weighing his. After a moment of appraising her, his expression opened into a polite smile. His eyes were warm in a way that surprised her, for no other reason than it was a kindness she hadn't expected. "It isn't too late to change your mind," something dark whispered into her ear. But despite her hesitations, she repaid his kindness with kindness. "Hello, sir, it is a pleasure to meet you. I am Margaret Wayland," she said, holding out her hand to him. "I'm Alan Jameson. And, I assure you, the pleasure is mine." He took her hand, and he appeared startled. It took a moment for Margaret to realize that he probably hadn't expected her skin to be so rough. Despite her burning ears and calloused hands, he bent down to place a kiss on her knuckles. She simply stared at him, ignoring the uncomfortable shifting of the others in the room. Finally, Margaret gave him a small smile. His eyes lit up then, which eased some of her nervousness. "As I said, normally we would have you two getting married within the hour of meeting, as stated by the contract you both signed when sending in your proposals," Ralph Fuller commented. "But, we're allowing a bit more time in this case." The feeling of being merchandise was starting to grow stronger in Margaret's heart again, though it was tempered by the realization that both she and Alan were in similar positions. Even the way Mr. Fuller watched them was bordering on demanding. Margaret faltered somewhat and nodded her head, indicating that she had no problem with the plan. After all, she had known what this would involve. "I have no problem with it, either," Alan responded, looking somewhat annoyed by the thinly veiled pressure. "Good," the businessman responded. His hands were knotted behind his back as he turned to the only other person in the room who had yet to speak. The elder seemed to take this as his cue. "Hello, Miss Wayland. My name is John Jones, and I'm the preacher in these parts. It will be my pleasure to marry the two of you." Jones smiled but made no movement to shake her hand or greet her in any other manner. For lack of a better response, Margaret replied with a platitude, thanking him for performing the ceremony on such short notice. Somehow, through the awkwardness, Margaret hadn't realized that she had yet to let go of Mr. Jameson's hand. She swallowed heavily, clasping her hand around the man's slightly rougher grasp. While her skin was rough from the last month of working in fields, his spoke of years of hard labor. She briefly recalled that before he was a rancher, he had been a miner. Alan squeezed her hand gently, as if to reassure her. She couldn't help but flush at the tenderness of his actions. She prayed she wasn't giving the impression of being too forward by letting him hold her hand immediately upon meeting her. But then, this entire situation seemed so unreal to her, that she wasn't sure which way was up. She stood, feeling almost itchy with discomfort. How could she be intimate with this man that she didn't even know? She couldn't abide the thought. "Mr. Jameson. Please, just Alan. I want you to understand something before we say our vows," she said, keeping her voice very low so only he could hear. I don't want to have children right away." She braced herself for his reaction. There was a flash of disappointment in his eyes that disappeared as quickly as it came. In its place came a look of understanding, which only caused her further discomfort. "Of course. There's no rush," he said. It was plain to see that he didn't quite believe his own words, but he seemed willing to adapt. She didn't know if that made her feel better or worse about the situation. A husband who was willing to agree and listen to his wife outside of their marital home was a good sign, wasn't it? Love was never the goal when she had sent out her application. She had only wanted out of her grief and away from her memories. At most, she had hoped for companionship, a camaraderie similar to the one she had shared with her brother before he. She shook her head at the thought. No, she didn't dare hope for love. She would love any children she gave him, if she ever allowed it to happen or if he ever got tired of her saying no all the time, but she hardly thought she'd ever love him. Margaret's thoughts went to her dress that held so many dollars and how he could never know about it. She must have an escape plan if she needed one. Chapter 8. For all of the few hours she had known him, Alan seemed a kind enough man. He never touched her in a way that made her uncomfortable beyond their first meeting and that handhold. On the walk back to what would be her new home, Alan had insisted on taking both of her trunks despite her protests. He laughed her off, saying that she had come a long way to be there and that this was the least he could do. He made no move to press close to her, and he was perfectly polite, attempting to make small talk. "In your letter, because that was the best way to refer to their adverts in common public, you mentioned that you lived on a farm before you came all this way to Colorado." He looked at her expectantly, seeming a bit surprised by that tidbit of fact. Margaret didn't know how any particular fact about her life was any more special than his own. "Yes. I used to help manage it with my brother. He mostly took care of the fields and the business end of things while I handled the household, the animals, and the garden." She hadn't been forced to do any heavy work until her brother had died, and then she'd nearly crumbled under the strain. "So, you know how to handle a farm. What about a cattle ranch?" She paused for a moment as she thought about the question. "It shouldn't be that different, I suppose. I'll still be tending animals, though I imagine most of my job will be taking care of the household just as I used to. As long as you put in your share of the work, I'll be fine." As soon as the words left her lips, her cheeks burned with shame. What a thing to say. Why would she imply that he was lazy or that he was marrying her just to get a worker? Alan's laughter startled her. The fear that she had made a mistake faded seconds after it emerged, and she allowed herself to relax somewhat, giving him a tired smile. "If you wouldn't mind, I'd like to ask you something." She forced herself to ask before she could crawl back into her shell. "Why did a man of your stature need to look past your own town to find a woman willing to be with you?" She found it rather impossible, now that she thought of it. He was handsome, and any woman, given that he had a fair head on his shoulders, would consider herself lucky to have him. There was a twinkle in his eye as he answered, "All the women round here are either married, too young, or know me from a time I'd much rather forget." Her eyebrows rose. Should she be worried by his last comment? It could mean multiple things. It could mean that he'd done something in his youth mostly harmless, but idiotic, or that he'd done something so unforgivable that no one would want their daughters married to him. The townsfolk didn't go out of their way to greet him in the streets on their way to his place, but then, he was not sneered or glared at either. Margaret was willing to make a tentative guess that it was the former. "What about you? What made you?" He trailed off, clearing, sensing her devastation. "You don't have to tell me," he finished, gently. Her lips trembled, but her only response was to shake her head. She couldn't bring herself to talk about it. It hurt just to think of her brother. There was no possible way she was ready to speak about him, much less to a complete stranger. Even if the stranger just so happened to be her future husband. Things began to move far too quickly for her liking after that. Alan was careful not to ask about her reasoning for leaving, but somehow most of his questions ended up coming back to it and reminding her of what she had lost. She tried to stuff back her memories of her brother and her parents, but it was hard. What would her parents have thought about her decision to flee west? Of course, she'd never know. She hoped they would be pleased with her, although at that moment, she wasn't at all sure she was pleased with herself. Alan's ranch was rather small compared to the farm she had once lived on, but by no means was it below standard. It was clear that the land was well kept and the house even more so. Seeing the house, Margaret actually gasped in surprise and gave a large smile at the lovely home. The clapboard had been freshly painted white and the porch in front with its rocking chair looked mighty welcoming. "For you," Alan said with a twinkle in his eye. The inside wasn't as glamorous, and she saw where she would be of use. Her fingers were itching to pull out the lone tablecloth she had brought from home to cover the main piece of furniture in what she assumed was the dining room. Alan gave her leave to put her items in the bedroom. She had a few minutes to panic, because here was the bed she would sleep in with her husband. There was little time to panic further as she was told that they would have to meet with the preacher once again to exchange their vows. The schedule of things made little sense to her. She hardly thought that these extra couple hours before the wedding would make a lick of difference. She knelt by one of her trunks and opened it carefully. With a sigh of determination, she pulled out her mother's old wedding gown. It had clearly faded over the years, but it was still sound, though some of the beading had gone missing. She glanced up, making sure the bedroom door was tightly shut, and then she shed her traveling gown. There was a stand with a basin and a pitcher of water. A bar of lye soap lay to the side. She quickly washed herself as best she could. Then she let down her hair, combed it, and twisted it into a bun at the nape of her neck. Holding her mother's dress reverently, she stepped into it. When she emerged from the room, she tried to ignore the way Alan looked at her and blamed the warmth spreading across her face on the tight fit of the wedding gown. Looking at his misfit suit and thinking of her slightly tighter than comfortable dress, she couldn't help but think they were quite the pair. Later in the church, her eyes filled with tears as the preacher performed the ceremony. It felt like a sham, truly. There was no father to give her away nor any friends to weep happy tears. There was simply the elderly preacher, Mr. Fuller, acting as a witness, and two strangers who promised to spend their entire mortal lives with one another. Chapter 9. Margaret felt silly for having made up so many horror stories on the train, when the reality of her new life was simply uneventful. She found herself tidying the household for the first week or so before she began to rearrange and order new furniture, all with her husband's blessing. Margaret rejected anything that remotely reminded her of her old home and went about creating a place that looked entirely different. The only thing that hinted of her past was the tablecloth, which for some reason had been important for her to keep. She did her utmost to appear happy and content, not wanting to give her new husband any reason for concern. However, she didn't think she was succeeding particularly well, for she saw him studying her at odd times. Alan had looked worried during their first days before he finally intervened when she cut herself on a broken plate she had dropped. "You can't do this anymore," he had begged, looking down at her. Clasping her hands within both of his, he was careful not to touch the wounds lest he accidentally hurt her. You're trying too hard. I hate seeing you in pain, Marg. She reacted to his nickname for her. You don't even know me, she snapped and immediately regretted her words. He was being kind, and she was being hateful. What was the matter with her? Didn't she want this to work? As she tried to pull her hands away from his in embarrassment, she ended up losing her balance and tipping into his chest. I don't want to lose you before I start to know you, he said gently. She stiffened, looking up at him in confusion. Once more, she tried to break free from his grip, though weakly, and again he held on tightly. He only softened his grip when she calmed against him. Margaret burst into tears as she now willingly pressed herself against his chest, curling up slightly as she sobbed her grief. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had held her the way he had. She couldn't remember the last time she felt as if nothing could touch her so long as she remained safe in someone's arms. I want to know you, Margaret. Please, let me. She wanted to, oh, how she wanted to. But they were still strangers in almost every way. She was afraid to trust him as she had once been able to trust others. Her faith in good things happening to her had ended when her brother died, simply because some outlaws had decided her brother's life was worth less than a few pieces of jewelry. After her incident of crying into Alan's shoulder, Margaret withdrew back into herself for a few days, tiptoeing around Alan like a skittish cat. Her embarrassment over her breakdown and her avoidance of her husband ended when he presented her with a gift. What is this? She asked when he gave her a bundle wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Just take it, he said, a small smile curving his lips. She frowned but took the large package. It was fairly heavy, and she had no idea what it was. Open it, he urged. She untied the string and unwrapped the paper, revealing a coat that suited the climate that had kept her locked indoors more days than not. It was a gorgeous garment that was thick and soft, something that a lady would boast of to her friends. She looked up, bewildered, knowing that she in no way deserved such a gift. Do you like it? He asked, and she saw the hope in his eyes. Her eyes stung with unshed tears at such kindness. She placed a quick kiss to his cheek and watched his tanned skin redden with pleasure. Try it on, he said. She did, running her hands down the warm heavy wool. It's lovely, she murmured. I'll wear it right now to gather the eggs. Chapter 10. Margaret cleaned and organized and made the ranch her home. She took on more duties as time passed and found her chores in the house waning as she finally decided that it could be called a home for the first time since she had come to Clay's Pike. Her relationship with Alan, despite her initial resistance, improved as he wormed his way under her skin with his kind, yet teasing, words. She laughed and delighted when he brought her wild grasses and decorated the house with his droopy bouquets. Margaret began to go stretches of an hour or two without remembering and feeling the pain of her brother's passing. You're smiling, Alan remarked to her one day when stood on the front lawn, observing the goats frolicking by the barn. She stared at him though the smile remained in place. What if I am, husband? I'm just trying to figure out where my glum-faced wife disappeared to and where this bright-eyed beauty came from, he teased, his face betraying nothing but innocent intent. It's your own fault. If you had wanted her to stay, you shouldn't have run her off. Margaret was stunned to realize that she was actually teasing him back. Why, if she didn't know better, she'd think she was flirting with him. Alan smiled, and Margaret's heart skipped a beat, and her palms grew damp. Alan stood close to her, closer than he would have ever dared with his skittish bride in the first few weeks of their marriage. Now, I wouldn't say that I ran her off. I'm pretty sure I'm starting to see her again. He raised his chin with a mischievous grin. Oh, is that how it is? She questioned, mock offense directed at the blue-eyed man. That's how it is. That's how it is, all right, she teased back, now escaping toward the porch. Marg, he whined, playfully grabbing at her ankles as she ascended the steps in front of him. She easily dodged him and hopped up onto the porch. I'm going to start cooking and you will finish your chores and get ready for dinner. It was easy to get lost in his laughter, to get caught up in her surroundings and the beauty that she had been afforded by this man that she now knew cared for her. She had long since stopped denying him access to their bed, citing that until they purchased or built another one, it was wasteful to not allow him a decent place to sleep. Waking up next to him had become natural, and every so often, she would wake up nestled in his arms. Margaret had promised herself that she wouldn't allow herself to love this rugged, beautiful man, but some mornings she found herself forgetting and pressing back into him. He was difficult not to love. It was not easy to keep her hands to herself when all she wanted to do was have the ability to wrap her arms around him and allow him to do the same in turn. However, that was dangerously close to something beyond friendship. She distracted herself from her growing affection by introducing herself to the neighbors who were disturbingly close, unlike the isolation that she had once delighted in. When she gardened, she found herself playing peekaboo with the son of the rancher closest to them who wandered over to their land. She found a sense of community that surprised her. She still had moments where she stared at her rough hands and remembered her brother, and sometimes she still cried herself to sleep, but she was getting better. Her husband, as if he were her own personal angel, would appear more often than not when she disappeared into herself. He would hold her tightly as if he could keep her anchored, keep her from floating away. When she apologized afterwards, he would tell her that there was no need and that he loved her. And that was another problem altogether. He loved her, and she wouldn't, love him back. The first time he admitted his love, she had scolded him and fled from the house. She had hidden in the tall grass, staring at the peaks of the mountains and, when it had grown dark, she'd counted the stars. Whenever her surroundings became too much to handle at night, she defaulted to counting the stars, beautiful and bright as they were. As much as she pushed for absolutely no similarities between her new home and her old, as time passed she grew homesick, wishing she had brought more than just her necessities with her. More than just the one tablecloth. Perhaps that was why she loved the stars. They never seemed to change, and that constant was enough to keep her homesickness mostly at bay. Another dent in Margaret's armor came the day a desperate mother named Sarah, the mother of the boy who liked to visit Margaret when she was out and about, came over begging for help. She begged Alan to go and get, and her exact phrasing was, that blood-sucking leech of a doctor. Upon her request, Alan had quickly jumped on his horse and left. Apparently, there was a doctor in town, but he refused to make calls when needed. He wanted his patients brought to him. But Sarah, this red-headed mother, was afraid to take her son that far. He was too sick. Instead, she had bundled him up and brought him to Margaret, saying it was much closer. At first, Margaret was practically frozen in place, completely unprepared for the situation, though she realized that this had happened many times a year in Maysville. She had always trusted in her ability to help those who were sick, but that was no longer the case. Not after she lost Jess. But the woman was frantic and had lost faith in the healer of the town. She looked as exhausted as she was devastated. One glance at the blotchy face of her small child and Margaret was up and reaching for the one thing that she had been unable to unpack. She had only one more vial of the tonic she had made for Eliza's child. She had thought to never have the need to use it, but she could hardly ignore this beautiful child. She could hardly ignore the desperation of his mother. Hurrying back over to the child and Sarah, she kneeled in front of them and placed her hands on Sarah's shoulder. Sarah looked desperately into Margaret's eyes and clutched the child closer to herself. "I have some training in healing, enough to help if you will let me," Margaret said, her eyes pleading for the distressed mother to believe her. Sarah unwound her grip on her boy, just enough for Margaret to check the child over. Margaret learned that the boy had already been sick multiple times over the last 2 months, and Margaret suspected it was something that the child had a weakness for during that time of the year. Her questioning confirmed that it was common for him to be sick around winter, but that it had been particularly worse that year for some reason. It had, naturally, put both parents into a frenzy. Sometimes children get sick when the seasons change. Most of the time, they grow out of it and lead healthy lives, she told Sarah before giving the woman the bottle, instructing her the same way she had instructed Eliza so many months before. A teaspoon, twice a day. Once in the morning and once before he goes to bed. Sarah nodded and thanked her. She left satisfied just before Margaret's husband came back frustrated and fuming at his inability to contact the doctor. "Where is she? And the boy?" Alan asked. "I sent them back home after I gave her some medicine." Alan looked at her for a moment in confusion. "You gave her medicine?" Seeing the doubt on her husband's face momentarily gave Margaret pause, and she wondered whether she'd done the right thing. But then she raised her chin and nodded. "I have some background in healing," she admitted. Alan's brow crinkled and then smoothed. "You are an amazing woman, Margaret," he said, and there was awe in his voice. Margaret relished in the hug she received that night and did not hesitate to curl into her husband, soaking up his comfort. Before falling asleep, Margaret applauded herself on not flinching when Alan whispered a small, "I love you," into her temple. But she still denied the feeling of warmth in her chest as she buried her face against his neck. "It hurts," she thought. Being loved still hurts, and love wasn't supposed to hurt. And those you love weren't supposed to die. The ache in her chest and the guilt she felt lingered as she fell asleep. Chapter 11. Sarah came over roughly a week later and hugged the ever-living daylights out of Margaret. Alan stood to the side, looking on at the spectacle with pure confusion that faded into understanding. "You saved him," the redhead whispered into Margaret's ear, repeating the words over and over. Margaret felt the warmth of pride and relief fill her heart. She was ever so glad she could be of help. As the other woman left, Margaret noticed that something had lightened. She hadn't realized until that moment just how heavy she had become, how her guilt and regrets had weighed her down. She cried in her husband's arms the moment the woman left, and she knew it was time to share her story with Alan. All of it. She told Alan about her parents who left her with her baby brother, and about her childhood friend who taught her most of what she knew about medicine. She told him about the happy years and the miserable end. She admitted how guilty she felt because "I took the gun when Jess offered it to me. I took the gun and left him without anything to defend himself with. It was her fault that he was dead. She had left him defenseless, and she hadn't been able to help him recover." "None of what happened was your fault," Alan insisted as she shook her head in denial. "It wasn't your fault, Marg. Even with a gun, they would have still shot him." Both of his hands came up to cup her cheeks. She sniffed as he wiped the tears from her face with his thumbs. But she was drowning in her guilt. And then she remembered the money. The money she was hiding from this man who had treated her with nothing but kindness. It was strange. She'd hardly thought about that money sewn into the lined pockets of the dress she'd hidden in the bottom of her trunk after she'd arrived. "You deserve so much better than me," she told Alan, letting out an ugly sob. "You deserve someone who doesn't lie to you and who can love you like you love her." Alan stayed silent for a moment and a weight seemed to settle in her stomach at the thought that she may have lost the last person she cared about in this world. "You have it wrong," he said huskily. "I'm so very lucky." She frowned at him, wondering if he'd even heard her confession. "You have it wrong," he repeated. "I found myself the most beautiful wife, but she doesn't think so. I love her so much, and I know that she loves me, but she's been hurt so bad that she's scared of it." Her lip trembled, and she shook her head in denial. "It's all right, love, I can wait." She cried into his chest that night just as she had cried into him many nights before. However, the next day she felt as if an infinite weight had been lifted from her. She could finally look upon her husband's relaxed and peaceful face and think, maybe everything wasn't fixed that one night, but it certainly began to break down Margaret's wall. She became more comfortable in accepting physical affection, and she teased and taunted Alan more readily, no longer fearful of what the future might dish out. As her reputation for healing spread across the town, Margaret found more and more people coming to her for help. It shocked her to realize that she had missed this. In her spare time, she found herself going into town more readily. Half of her garden was to be dedicated to herbs for her brews and salves. The guilt of her secret money weighed heavily on her, and she debated whether she should tell Alan about it, but she found herself putting it off over and over again. She wondered how horrible a woman she must be not to trust him by now. He surely wouldn't take the money from her, and that money could greatly benefit the ranch. It would allow them to expand their cattle and open opportunities outside of their current sphere of influence. But Margaret held her tongue and stomped the guilt deep down. She was happy enough, and she couldn't allow herself to give away the only thing she had left. Good things never truly lasted, did they? The day would come when she would have to take care of herself. The day would come when she'd be alone again. Chapter 12. The first signs of Alan's illness had Margaret on edge and watching her husband closely. It started out as a simple cough but escalated quickly to full-on wheezing. She watched with great horror as one morning when he stood from their kitchen table, he collapsed back down to the floor. She cried out and flashbacks grabbed a hold of her, remembering finding her brother face down in his own blood on the floor of their front room. Now, she prayed to every saint she could think of as she kneeled next to Alan. He came to, vaguely aware, dizzy and tired. Despite his protests, she dragged him to their shared bed and tucked him under the sheets. Her first assumption was that he had gotten sick from the cold winds and that it would pass with medicine. A few days went by, and he became worse. She sobbed at the thought that this might go the same direction as it had gone with her brother and her parents. Margaret put away her medicinal box and went to town after asking one of Alan's friends to stay with him while she went for the doctor. "I need the doctor," she pleaded with the mercantile owner. "His office is locked shut. Do you know where he is?" The paunchy man puckered his lips and shook his head. "Heard there's some kind of epidemic in lands crossing down the way. Doc's over there. He won't be back for some time, the way I hear it." "No," she cried. She hitched up her skirts and ran back to Alan's horse. She mounted it and raced wildly back to their ranch. This is just like what happened with Jess, she thought wildly, urging the horse to go faster. I couldn't save him. She would lose Alan just as she had lost everyone else in her life. The next day, Alan threw up over the side of the bed. He refused to eat and whatever he did somehow managed to swallow was almost immediately rejected. Margaret's tears refused to halt as she sat next to him, sponging him with cool cloths and doing her best to get tiny sips of water down his throat. That afternoon, there was a banging on the door. Margaret lurched up from her vigil and ran to open it, praying it was the doctor. It was Sarah. "I heard your husband's sick," she said. Margaret's eyes welled with tears. "He's awful bad." "So was my lad," Sarah said. "You can fix Alan. You got more doctrine in you than anybody I know." I don't know what to do." "Yes, you do. Just listen to your own wisdom." Sarah looked about the cluttered kitchen, which had become a bigger mess every day since Alan had fallen ill. "I'm cleaning up in here, and I'm going to make your man some warm soup. And he'll eat it, too. You mark my words." Sarah rolled up her sleeves and without another word, got busy in the kitchen. Margaret inhaled deeply and watched her for a moment. What if she boiled some chamomile tea? What if she made a compress of linseed and licorice root? She had the ingredients, didn't she? Margaret squared her shoulders. This wasn't the time to succumb to fear. She had to take more action. Sarah was right. Margaret rushed to get the ingredients needed from her bag and began working to make the poultice. Sarah watched her with a smile before getting back to the dirty dishes. Poultice in hand, Margaret hurried back to her husband. She lay a thin cloth over his chest and applied the compress. He winced at the heat, but she held it in place with another cloth. For the next hours, she sat by his side, watching his flushed face with dark rings underneath his once enchanting eyes. She sponged his forehead and replaced the compress repeatedly. She also brewed a tea of ginger and white willow. She cringed as he threw up the concoction minutes after he reluctantly drank it. The second attempt at treatment was a cup of warm water with a few drops of metasweet extract mixed in. She was relieved to see that he kept it down and so she continued to give it to him every few hours, unwilling to give him anything else should he reject it, or should it mix badly with the warm water. Sarah finished cleaning the kitchen and, true to her word, made a warm thin vegetable broth. She came into the bedroom and spoke quietly to Margaret. "The soup is ready," she murmured. "You'll likely wait a bit to give him some, but it's there when the time is right. I'm going back home now. I'm sure my husband is needing me." Margaret stood and hugged her dear new friend. With tears in her eyes, she thanked her. "I'll see you soon," Sarah said. She looked at Alan. "Both of you." And then, she was gone. Margaret sat back down and held Alan's hand tightly. There was nothing more she could do but wait. How had she been so foolish as to not admit her love to Alan? How had she thought that would protect her? Why couldn't I say it, she asked aloud. Why was I so afraid to tell you that I loved you? I don't understand how I was such a coward. She gave a start when Alan began to mutter quietly. She tried to pick out the words, but she was quick to realize that he was delirious. She continued to replace the damp cloth on his forehead for a fresh one every hour, just as she dribbled the metasweet-infused water down his throat. I never told you, she said to his sleeping form. But when I sold the farm, I brought the money with me here. I had no family to give it to, and I thought that maybe, if this didn't turn out like I hoped, I would have been able to walk out of here and start a new life with that money. She knew it was ridiculous to confess to someone who was not conscious, but she felt her spirit lightening as she spoke. I didn't trust you, and that will be my biggest regret if you. Her voice broke, but she forced herself to continue. Please, stay with me. I'm begging you. I adore you, Alan. I love you more than I ever thought I could love anyone. Don't leave me. She was begging with her hands clenched tightly around one of his. But there was no response. No change. She sat wearily all night by his side, with only the wavering light of a candle. She didn't fall asleep. She continued giving him the medicine and continued praying. She was beyond exhausted as she leaned over his bed, her eyes drifting closed every so often. She was ready to collapse in despair when he stirred. Marg, his raspy voice questioned, and her head snapped up in shock. There, awake and aware, was Alan, very much alive. Margaret lifted a hand to his forehead, and she could have sworn that he wasn't as warm as he'd been before. She also noticed that he was sweating up a storm. She let out a nearly delirious bout of laughter that ended in a sob of relief. Alan, she cried, and he smiled up at her with that lopsided grin that she had grown to love so much. I could have sworn I heard you say you loved me. She laughed incredulously. The first thing you say after days of nothing, had to be that? He smiled at her knowingly, though clearly exhausted from the battle he had waged. I love you. I'm assuming you also heard me confess about the money, too, she asked, grabbing his hand with pure joy. He put his hand to his throat and visibly swallowed. She immediately gave him some water. He coughed but kept it down. He gazed at her and smiled. It hurt some that you had to wait until I was near dead to tell me about it. It's your money to do with it what you will. I ain't going to take it away from you. She smiled and shook her head. The money's going to go into your ranch. Our ranch. It's going to go into this land and into our children's future. His eyes softened, and he looked at her with such warmth that she questioned again why she hadn't admitted her love for him. If this is the welcome back I get, I should get sick more often, he remarked, ever the teaser. She glared at him for even daring to suggest putting them through that again. You do this again, and I'm naming all our children after my side of the family, she whispered, climbing up into the bed with him and curling into his side. I wouldn't mind that. She giggled a little, as he wrapped his arm around her for the first time in days. I love you, she whispered. He responded with a kiss to her forehead. Margaret prayed that they would have forever to make up for lost time. She smiled softly as she began to doze off into an easy slumber, knowing that Alan would be right there at her side when she awoke. The end. Thank you for listening to this heartwarming story by Susannah Calloway. You can be assured that all her books are clean and wholesome. To find other romances by Susannah Calloway, as well as the other authors at Tika House Publishing, visit www.tikahousepublishing.com. Remember to hit like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next Susannah Calloway Western romance.